Welcome back to Module 12 of Com 3073, Conducting Communication Inquiry. Last time I walked you through what experiments are and the different types of quasi-experiments and classic experiments that exist in quantitative research. I hope you took from it that in experiments, we try to manipulate the independent variable to be either high or low, present or absent, and see what its influence is on a measured dependent variable. Remember that the independent variable is the cause, and the dependent variable is the effect in causal terms. You should have also taken away from these modules that tightly controlled classic experiments are one of the very few ways that we can test causal relationships in quantitative research. We simply can't do it in a one-shot questionnaire because we can't test time ordering, among other things. In this module, we're going to talk about threats to the interpretability of our experiments. By threats, I mean any occurrence or event that can happen in the course of the experiment that contaminates the results of the study. And by contaminates the results, I mean that anything that can happen that can obscure the conclusions drawn from the relationship between the independent variable and dependent variable from the experiment. In other words, experimental validity is all about things that can happen that can make us less trusting of the results. So let's get into the content of Module 12. As always, I wanted to present to you a roadmap of where we're going in today's discussion to give you some guidance on how to structure your notes. First, I'm going to talk about two different types of experimental validity: internal validity and external validity. These different types of validities affect the conclusions you can draw from your experiments. Next, I'm going to focus our attention on several different threats to internal validity and talk about some ways that you can avoid them. We'll talk about history effects, maturation effects, and some group effects that can happen when participants find out that they're either in the control group or the experimental group. Then, we're going to very briefly turn our attention to external validity threats. We'll focus on population validity and ecological validity. Finally, I'll present ways to prevent or at least spot these threats. In most cases, I'll tell you that random assignment and employing a control group and experimental group are always going to be the best answer to preventing any threats to validity. So let's get into the content. There are two types of experimental validity I want to discuss. The first is internal validity and the second is external validity. Now you might remember back to our discussion of measurement where we covered the topic of validity. If you remember back to that video, I presented the idea that validity is really all about whether the thing the measure says it's measuring is really what it is. The same thing applies here, but in the context of experimental results. In other words, it's answering the question, are the results truly what the researcher says they are? Internal validity refers to whether the experiment, in its design and execution, is free from flaws. It goes to the heart of how well an experiment is controlled. And when I say controlled, I mean controlled from external forces like confounds that might obscure the conclusions we can draw from the experiment regarding the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. External validity is a little different from internal validity. External validity addresses how generalizable the findings from your experiment can be to the population and to various circumstances. If the experiment is so sterile and far removed from reality then it's difficult to say that your results will hold up outside of the laboratory manipulated setting. In the remainder of this video, we'll talk about specific types of both internal and external validity, and I'll provide you with examples along the way. Threats to internal validity contaminate the results of experiments by inviting questions into the real reason why the dependent variable changed after exposure to the manipulation. In a very simple one-group pre-test post-test quasi-experimental design, if a researcher concludes that the manipulation of the independent variable caused changes in the dependent variable from before and after that exposure, he or she is making a leap of faith because we already know that quasi-experimental designs are not true experiments. They just masquerade as experiments. There could be things that happen either at the same time as the manipulation or shortly after the manipulation is given that may be responsible for the change in the dependent variable. The question you must always ask yourself as a prudent researcher when reading the results of any experiment is there something other than the manipulated independent variable that explains the effect or changes in the dependent variable? Let me give you a crude example of how internal validity can threaten a lay experiment. Let's say that you find yourself in the school library and you're trying to get a paper written and study for an upcoming exam, but you're feeling really sluggish. In fact, you're so tired that you think to yourself, how am I possibly going to stay up and finish all the work that I have to complete? You start thinking of the different ways you know how to energize yourself and come up with the hypothesis that maybe drinking a cup of coffee, the independent variable, will increase my work productivity, in this case, the dependent variable. So you begin by evaluating how much productivity you currently have, then you go downstairs, purchase a venti pikes, and down it in the next 5 minutes. You go back to your work area in the library and find an hour later that your output has gone through the roof. You conclude that the coffee consumption caused improved work productivity. There's just one thing. You realize that while you're evaluating your work productivity, that you also bought and ate a cookie from Subway while you were downstairs because you were hungry. You unfortunately contaminated the experiment because we really don't know whether the increased work productivity was caused by the caffeine in the coffee or the sugar in the cookie. Therefore, the introduction of the external force, the cookie, made it difficult to see whether changes in the dependent variable were caused by the manipulation. The first threat to internal validity is called history effects. History effects mainly happen when there's an event between the pretest and post-test that you as the researcher didn't intend the participants being exposed to, which makes it difficult to know if your manipulation or this unexpected event caused changes in the dependent variable. Here's an example. I once did a one-group pre-test post-test study where I wanted to see how the act of looking at one's cell phone while engaged in a conversation with a stranger affected the cell phone looker's perceptions of social attractiveness. So in this experiment, I had participants meet with a stranger who just so happened to be my confederate for 2 minutes and complete a brief social attractiveness measure on her. After, they were told to chat about their recent experiences with classes at the university for another 5 minutes. During this conversation, the confederate was instructed to pull out her cell phone and peruse her Facebook account while they were speaking. After this conversation, I told participants that they needed to log into an online survey site and complete the post-test questionnaire, which included the same social attractiveness measure as the pretest. I noticed that after looking at the data, the difference between the people's pretest and post-test scores of the Confederate social attractiveness was significantly different from 0. I concluded that using a cell phone while having a conversation with a stranger causes decreased perceptions of social attractiveness. What's the problem? After each and every lab experiment, you notice that your confederate leaves the laboratory and takes a cigarette break because it's a stressful job. Every single participant sees the confederate smoking outside the lab. So knowing this, you as a researcher have to ask yourself, did the cell phone use while talking lead to changes in social attractiveness, or could it have been this unexpected event, the Confederate smoking, that lowered people's perceptions of her social attractiveness? This is an example of history effects. Here's another example of history effects that might be more concrete using an actual historical event. Imagine that you were interested in seeing whether attitudes towards immigrants changed from exposing participants to newspaper articles that addressed race and immigration to test the idea of aversive racism. During the pre-test phase, you asked all participants to take a questionnaire that included an attitudes towards immigrants measure. Then, for the next 2 weeks, you exposed your sample to various newspaper articles meant to prime race and immigration in their minds. You then gave participants a post-test questionnaire that includes the same attitudes towards immigrants measure as the pre-test. You find in your data analysis that negative, not positive attitudes towards immigrants increased, tacitly rejecting your hypothesis on aversive racism. You notice a few days later that during the time between your pre-test and post-test, the president signed key emergency declarations, putting extensive bans on worker visas, effectively not allowing immigrants to freely enter into this country. The declarations have been discussed in the news at lengths. In this situation, you really don't know whether the newspaper articles or news on the new bans of immigrants cause changes in participants' attitudes. Therefore, this example is indicative of history effects. A maturation effect is a biological or psychological process that happens within an individual that varies with time. For instance, if you were doing a one-group pre-test post-test quasi-experiment on vegetable consumption and height in children, you'd need to be concerned about what the data tell you, because height will naturally increase even in spite of vegetable consumption with children over time. I'll share with you some of the things I have to look out for in my intervention studies on cyberbullying. For some of my applied, not basic research, if you remember the difference, I take cyberbullying interventions like workshops, eye-safety education classes, and workbooks that others have created and see if they really work in curbing cyberbullying in schools. So to do this, I might ask a group of children about how frequently they cyberbully others in a pretest. Then I'll expose this group to a cyberbullying campaign, and then ask about cyberbullying frequency in a post-test. If I find during the data analysis that, wow, cyberbullying perpetration went down, I might be making a faulty claim about how well the intervention or campaign caused reductions in cyberbullying. Why? Because of the maturation effects I talked about earlier. Because the children naturally matured and grew older during the course of the investigation, I don't really know whether it was the cyberbullying campaign or their maturity that caused changes in cyberbullying frequency. We actually talked about testing effects in our previous video when I presented the idea of pre-test, post-test designs. Testing effects arise from changes in participants' reactions or responses to the measured dependent variable from anything they learned in the pretest. I'll show you the slide you already saw to remind you about testing effects. Remember that testing effects occur when you have a pretest that primes participants to think about and pay close attention to the dependent variable during the course of the manipulation and change their responses on the post-test to something that wouldn't be typically representative of them if they were blind to the study goals. Or they might change their responses in the direction that they think the researcher would want them to answer. Let me give you a very brief example of testing effects. Let's say I'm interested in doing a very simple study on the effects of listening to classical music on negative moods. In the pretest, I ask participants to fill out Watson, Clark, and Tellegen positive and negative affect scale, otherwise known as PANIS. The measure asks participants through 10 items about their negative mood states. Things like, to what extent am I distressed? To what extent am I upset? To what extent am I irritable? And to what extent am I nervous? You can see that all of these items tap negative mood states. Observant participants might think to themselves after taking this pretest, wait, this study is about moods, particularly negative moods, and become hyper-aware of their own moods when attention to such moods would otherwise be unnatural. So, participants might think about their negative moods while taking the pretest, during the manipulation, and even on the post-test. Some participants might even go the extra step of answering in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect their true perceptions, cognitions, or motivations, but they answer in a way that they think will help the researcher. These are all part of testing effects. The next threat to internal validity is called statistical regression to the mean. It happens particularly when you administer a pretest to your full group of participants, just so you can get a smaller sample of extreme cases. So if I'm interested in getting a sample of individuals with clinical levels of depression or internet addiction, I might ask 100 college students to complete a depression inventory or even an internet addiction test, and then take the top 10% of highest scorers in the entire group. What will naturally occur, even if your manipulation doesn't work at all, is that the average score of this subsample will move toward the mean of the whole group. Why does this occur? Because of sampling bias and people's psychological tendency to respond in less extremes with repeated measurement. Now, to be clear, most of your subgroup participants will still remain in the top 10% on the post-test, but even if a few change, it'll pull the average of the subgroup down toward the mean, and the researcher might erroneously conclude that changes in the dependent variable of this subgroup was caused by the manipulation and not naturally occurring statistical regression to the mean. This is an example of regression threat. Experimental mortality is all about participants dropping out of your study and what that can mean for your results. I should tell you that in longer experiments or longitudinal survey studies, it's not uncommon for participants to drop out. In fact, it's not uncommon to lose about 10% of all participants from beginning to the end. So it's not that attrition in a study is inherently problematic. It is, however, problematic when participants drop out systematically or for all the same reason rather than randomly. Let me give you an example. Suppose I wanted to see whether couples using accommodative language during conflicts versus aggressive language improves relational satisfaction. You have participants fill out a questionnaire containing a relational satisfaction measure in the pretest. Then you train couples on how to use accommodative language during conflicts and direct them to use this newfound skill in their relationship over the next month. You then have couples complete a post-test after a month. You find that relational satisfaction improved over the month, but you also discover that 25% or 1 in 4 couples dropped out of the study. You have to ask yourself, did they drop out randomly, or was there a reaction to the manipulation that caused the attrition of 25%? After all, it could be that 25% broke up after using accommodative styles. There is one procedure that can give you some insight into whether experimental mortality played a role in your results. You should always see whether there's a statistical difference in the pretest scores on the dependent variable between those who stayed in and those who dropped out. If there are differences, it might be an indicator that there are systematic rather than random attrition problems, which is a real threat to the internal validity of your study. I've only so far talked about threats to internal validity that can happen on the individual level, but these threats can also emerge as a function of being part of a group. Diffusion or design contamination effects occur when participants in the control group talk to participants in the experimental group, and it's discovered through this communication that participants in the control group didn't receive a manipulation. There can be two possible group effects that come from this knowledge. One is known as compensatory rivalry, or more commonly known as the John Henry effect. If you remember back to the folklore of John Henry, he was a powerful steel driver who was said to have the power to hammer steel drills into rocks for explosives to create a railroad tunnel. His speed and strength were tested against a rock drilling machine equipped with a steam-powered engine. He pounded his way to victory against the steam-powered rock driller, only to die from the stress on his heart. Although the dying part has no allegory to group effects, the idea of relentless competition does. In compensatory rivalry, the control group that knows that they didn't receive the manipulation works extra hard to make up for the effects of that missing manipulation. In resentful demoralization, participants in the control group go in the exact opposite direction. They become resentful and foreboding and stop performing at their normal levels. You can see how the imbalance or difference then between a control and experimental group might have little to do with the manipulated independent variable, but rather that information about group status led to these differences. External validity, different of course from internal validity, is all about how generalizable the results of your study are to the population. It asks the question, are the results of the experiment likely to be the same across other samples in the population or other settings and scenarios? There are two different types of external validity of which I want you to be particularly aware. The first is population validity, and it asks the question, how representative is the sample that you drew from the population to that population? Of course, if you drew the sample using strict random sampling procedures, the chances will be very high. But if you selected participants more non-randomly, that chance will be very low. The greater the bias between your sample and the population, the less likely it is that your results will be true in that population. The second is called ecological validity. Ecological validity asks the question, how real or representative are the conditions of your study to the real world? Many experiments are conducted in sterile lab settings with very contrived manipulations that just wouldn't happen in the real world. The unnaturalness of these experiments makes participants acutely aware and mindful of their behavior and thoughts. We saw this with the example of the Hawthorne effect last week. So the more unnatural and contrived the experimental setting and manipulation, the less likely the results will hold up in the population and thus create a threat to external validity. There's one final point I wanted to make about population validity before we end. Do you care to guess what kinds of samples have dominated the test of theories in the social and behavioral sciences? I'll give you a hint. Yup. College students. Why? Because it's convenient. Most of the scholars who generate and test theories are university professors, and they work on campuses where college students are readily available to be their participants. It's a match made in heaven. Or is it? The problem basing all of our theories on data taken from college students is that they are notoriously unrepresentative of the population at large. In fact, we refer to college students as weird. Not weird in the you're weird sense, but weird as an acronym for white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Now, of course, this doesn't apply to all college students, but on average, this is what college students represent, and you can see how that's unrepresentative of the population as a whole. That's all I have for Module 12. Thanks for sticking around until the end of this video. Please don't forget to read the textbook pages listed in the syllabus, and please remember to complete the quiz for this module. We covered a fair amount of information in today's video. Now that you're confident you can devise an experiment on your own, you need to consider all of the things that can come up during the experiment that could serve to contaminate the results. We started today's discussion by talking about internal validity and external validity as they relate to experiments. We then transitioned into specific threats to internal validity and a couple of threats to external validity. We ended with an example of population validity threats and weird college students. I hope you found this video to be informative and helpful. As usual, please don't hesitate to contact me if any questions come up about the short assignment or the readings. Have a great remainder of your week, and I'll see you back next time. Peace out.